Hello, everyone. Here I'll present some work that I've been doing with my collaborators to observationally quantify spectral fluxes in the ocean. So here's a schematic describing our best guess at what ocean macro turbulence is likely doing. And this has been pieced together primarily with the help of numerical simulations. So basically what is suggested is that the ocean is forced at the large scales, especially the potential energy reservoir by winds and heating. This potential energy can be released to kinetic energy by baroclinic instability, and some of it gets transferred to small scales by eddy stirring, where frontogenesis can also convert it to kinetic energy. Now, once the potential energy has reached or been injected into the kinetic energy, it can get cascaded to larger scales through an inverse cascade, or it can get cascaded to smaller scales in a forward cascade. This forward cascade has been shown only with the help of numerical simulations, and the strength really depends on the numerical simulation that you look at, varying from a few percent, from a strength of a few percent of the inverse cascade to being as large as about 30%. As far as I know, this forward cascade has never been observed in the ocean. So a lot of questions remain. First, does this exist? If it exists, what is the strength? Does the strength vary seasonally? Is there a geographical variability, etc.? So in my talk, I'll address the first three of these questions. Now, to access information at scales that are small enough to observe the forward cascade, we need observations of velocity fields down to hundreds of meters. Further, if you want to also observe the inverse cascade in conjunction, we would prefer to observe the flows at the larger scales at the same time. To satisfy this criteria, we turn to two deployments of surface drifters in the Gulf of Mexico. One was done in summer of 2012, which was called GLAD, and another one that was done in winter of 2016, which was called LASER. During GLAD, about 300 drifters were deployed in clusters at these black locations, and during LASER, about 1,000 drifters were deployed at these locations marked by the black lines. And so here I'm showing you what an overview of where the drifters started, where they went over the 2 or 3 month period that they were in the water. And in the back, the contours are showing the bathymetry of the region, blue being deeper. I should also note that the surface drifters were tracking the flow very close to the surface, basically integrated over the top 60 centimeters of the water column. Now, as is clear from these plots, the two deployments resulted in very different looking dispersion characteristics. In the summer, the drifters were contained mostly in the northern Gulf, while in the winter, they spread all over the place. And this difference is likely due to the differences in the mesoscale field that was present during the two deployments. However, if we look at smaller scales, for example, if we consider the frequency spectrum, we can see that, well, first of all, both seasons show the presence of a strong inertial oscillation peak. But this peak is much stronger in the summer compared to the winter, and this might have something to do with the fact that the mixed layers are also shallower in the summer. Now I'll show you a movie of these drifters. Again, black dots show where they're released, red dots show where they're going, or the endpoints. And you'll be able to see in these clearly that in summer, there's a lot of inertial oscillations which show up visually, but we don't see them very much in the winter. Another thing that you see is that some of the drifters are making their way to the continental shelf, which is marked by this black dashed line. And so in the the dynamics on the continental shelf are presumably very different from the dynamics that are going on in the deeper ocean. So the analysis that I'll be presenting going on from here is only for the deeper ocean. So we only consider the tracks that stayed in the deeper part and basically discard the tracks that go onto the continental shelf. Now I know that this movie went by really quick, and if you wanted to watch it at leisure, you can either watch this, rewind and watch this video again, or you can pause now and use this QR code to go to a link of the movie. So now, usually when we want to analyze properties of flow in a scale-wise manner, we use a decomposition in Fourier space. And this allows us to break up the energy into modes, and each mode is assigned a length scale based on the wavelength or frequency of the particular Fourier component. This works really well if we have uniformly sampled data, like we did for the drifters in time. And the drifters are so the drifters have a resolution of 15 minutes in time, and we could use this uniform gridding to calculate the frequency spectra that I showed you earlier. But if we want to do this decomposition in space, the drifters or any observations for that matter in the ocean do not provide us well-gridded velocity fields. And so we need some method that can work with ungridded scattered data. And so we need to go to real space. So the idea here is that we look at 2-point moments, such as the covariance. If we have two drifters shown as the green and the blue lines over here, then at some point in time, we get a sample of two velocities in space, which are separated by some position vector r. Now in practice, and we can find the covariance between these 2 points. But now in practice, we work with a quantity that's called a structure function, where we consider the difference in velocity components between the 2 points, delta u, and its moments. So for example, the second order structure function would be delta u squared, and that would be related to the covariance. And the third order structure function would be a cubed quantity, like delta U cubed, and that will be related to the spectral flux, which I'll show next. Now, to understand a rough physical sense as to how we get at scales from this, consider this diagram. If we have a sea of eddies where small eddies are essentially embedded in larger ones, the velocity differences or correlation between 2 points that are farther apart say a lot more about the larger scales, while the points that are closer together say something about the smaller eddies. We can solidify this hand-wavy argument mathematically by realizing that, for example, the covariance is related to the power spectrum through a Fourier transform. This is the Wiener-Khinchin theorem. And similarly, the second order structure function, which is related to the covariance, is also related to the power spectrum by this kernel over here. And we can also show that the third order structure function, which we're going to call V going forward, is related to the spectral flux F, also through a similar sort of relationship. And I just want to point out that these J naughts and J2 are Bessel functions that are appearing over here because we have assumed isotropy over here. So going forward, what we'll do is we will try to get an estimate of VR in real space, which we can do with the help of drifters by basically taking all drifter pairs that we have and binning them in bins at different separation scales. And then we will take averages in each of these bins. And so when we average over bins over the full experiment, it roughly translates into a spatial and temporal average. So here is what the third order structure function, or V, looks like from the two experiments. So just a side note over here, the estimates of these quantity have been published in the literature before, starting from a paper that I published in 2016 and a paper that came out at about the same time in 2017, and more in more papers subsequently. So what I'm plotting over here is the absolute value of V, because this is a log axis, and this value is plotted against the separation scale. And to mark places or scales where the V is negative, I've used a dashed line, and the positive values are marked as solid lines. And so we see two clear things. The first thing that we see is that SF3 is roughly, or VR is roughly linear over this entire range of scales. It follows the power law of about R is to 1. And the second clear signal that we see is that SF3 is negative at smaller scales and positive at larger scales. And the scale where the sign change happens seems to vary in as a function of season or as a function of experiment in this case. Now, in these previous studies that I mentioned over here, the range of these negative values was taken to be indicative of a downscale cascade of energy. This is based on exact relationships like Richardson's 4/3 law that are inertial range theories. However, since the ocean is not exactly, exactly like 2D turbulence or 3D turbulence, it's always questionable whether the inertial range theories actually apply. And before moving on, I also want to remark that a similar property of negative values at smaller scales was observed in the atmosphere about 2 decades ago by Chu and Lindbergh in their study in 2001. So going forward, ideally what we would like to be, so this is the relationship between V and the third order structure function and the spectral flux that I showed you earlier. And so now we have estimates of V from observations, but what we really want is FK. And so there's an analytical inverse relationship that exists, but as it happens to be, this operation is a smoothing operation in one direction. So if essentially VR is a type of a smooth form or a smooth version of FK. And so if we try to do this, invert this either analytically or numerically, small scale noise always gets amplified, and the FK or the spectral flux that we estimate is that estimate is essentially worthless. So we need to be a little bit more clever. And so what we did over here is we first discretized the spectral flux into basis functions, which are physically motivated. And so there's a constant value that corresponds to an upscale energy flux, and then there are a number of discrete energy injections at different scales. Now, once we have this discrete form, we can analytically integrate it using this relationship to get the corresponding expression of V. And so the nice thing about this form is that first, it's discrete. Second, the infinities have been, we've gotten rid of those. And then the other nice thing is that we can, we know V from our drifters, and we want to find these epsilons so that we can reconstruct F. And so we can solve this problem by least squares. And when we are solving it, we can add in some additional physical assumptions, as which often we call a regularization. And the assumptions that we have over here is that we assume that epsilons are positive. And this is a physically justified assumption. And so basically when we are saying that epsilons are positive, we are assuming two things. One, we are saying that all the dissipation in the system lies outside the range of scales that we are making observations at. And also, if there is any conversion from kinetic energy back to potential energy, that also is taking place outside this range. So by making this assumption, we are essentially only allowing for a transfer of energy from potential energy or some direct forcing directly into the surface kinetic energy. And we don't have a way to test this hypothesis, but if you look at numerical simulations, we do find that usually the transfer in the submesoscale range is one way from potential energy to kinetic energy. So let's see what happens when you solve this problem. So here I'm plotting the third order structure function again, but since it was, we realized earlier that it follows a power law, a linear power law, we normalize it by a separation scale of R. And what this allows us to do is that now we can plot this, this quantity on a linear scale, and we can see the negative values and the positive values without taking the absolute value. And we can also plot the error bars much more easily. Now the dashed black line, just to sort of clarify, the top row is going to correspond to GLAD or the summer experiment, which is shown in red, and the bottom row is going to correspond to laser or winter experiments, which are shown in blue. And the dashed black line shows us the fitting that we get from least squares. And basically what it's showing us is that the least square does a very good fit, and the regularization ensures that every single small detail is not fit. So we're not overfitting the every single synoptic variability that we might be seeing in this estimate. And so now we plot the energy injection scales that are estimated. So going back a second, these are these quantities epsilon j's. And I also want you to take note that over here, the scale was increasing from the left-hand side to the right-hand side as it was separation scale, but now we have gone to wave number, and the scale is increasing to the left. And so large scales are over here, small scales are over here. And so, we see that the first thing that we see in these two plots is that there is an energy injection that's taking place at relatively larger scales, which is about 50 kilometers. And this energy injection and this scale is very close to what the interior deformation radius in this region is. And there is not a lot of seasonal modulation, neither in the scale of this injection nor in its strength. But we see that there is a second distinct range of scales where energy injection takes place. And this corresponds or is roughly corresponding to the mixed area deformation radius. And so in summer, this is at smaller scales, about 1 kilometer. And in winter, it has moved up to about 5 kilometers. Also in winter, the strength of this energy injection has increased in magnitude. Now, finally coming to the spectral flux, which is the hero calculation that we've all been waiting for. So what we see is that at the largest range of scales that are observed, there's an upscale energy flux. And it does not change much with season. While at the smallest scales, there's a downscale flux. Now, the direction of the scale where the direction of the flux changes from being upscale to downscale changes as a function of seasons. It's about 5 kilometers in winter, and it's about 1 kilometer in summer. And the other thing that we also note is that the downscale flux is about 2 or 3 times stronger than the in winter is about 2 or 3 times stronger than the downscale flux that we see in summer. And the final thing that I want to note is that the strength of the downscale flux is actually quite large. It is about 25 to 40%, depending on the season, of the upscale flux. And that is a lot. And another thing that I want to note is that, even though we see that a lot of the energy is cascading to downscale at these smaller scales, it is not all of the energy that was injected at the smaller length scale. So the energy that's being injected at the smaller length scale is only a fraction of that cascades downscale. And some of this energy injected at smaller scales also cascades in an inverse cascade to larger scales. So before I conclude, I just want to mention that as with all observational estimates, the estimates we present here have their inherent biases. These observations were over a short period, so there are going to be errors that are just going to be associated with how representative they are of what's going on over long time periods. Also, the drifters have a tendency to collect in convergence zones, which can potentially bias estimates of the downscale flux to be maybe too high if we think that the convergence zones are where a lot of dissipation might be taking place. But regardless, what we did here is that we presented the first observational evidence of a dual energy cascade. We found that the energy is injected at 2 primary scales. One is near the interior deformation radius, and another one is near the mixed deformation radius. The energy that's injected at the smaller scale, so the smaller scale injection, is modulated seasonally, both in terms of what scale the energy gets injected in, and also the strength of this energy flux. And finally, we find that about 25 to 40% of the energy that's getting injected into the surface flow gets cascaded to smaller scales. And that is definitely on the higher range of what numerical simulations have shown us so far. So thank you, and I'll see you in the live session. during ocean sciences.